Private equity companies have recently drawn the ire of most people, and the scrutiny of these companies recently reached a climax, with a call for a congressional hearing on the operations of these companies in healthcare.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I've previously raised in this committee, community hospitals across our country have faced significant financial challenges over the years, challenges that were deepened by the pandemic and in some cases are being made even worse by a private equity model that puts profits squarely above our patients and their care.
In this video, we will look at private equity investments in healthcare, how their operations impact healthcare products and services, and the direct and indirect impacts these companies have on select segments of the healthcare delivery system as well as healthcare consumers. But first, let's take a step back to understand what private equity companies do. So, what are private equity companies and what do they do? Private equity companies are investment firms that raise capital and use that capital to invest in other entities, with the potential to improve the revenues and profitability of those entities, and then later sell them for a sizable profit. Private equity companies usually raise money from other entities like pension funds, family offices of high net worth individuals, endowments, etc., with an agreement to return profits based on the terms and conditions. The private equity companies then search for viable opportunities to deploy the raised capital for maximum returns, which is where healthcare comes into the picture. Healthcare is very attractive to private equity companies for specific reasons. But before we look at those reasons, let's take a quick look at some of the top private equity companies in America with investments in healthcare. Some of these companies include Blackstone, KKR and Company, Apollo Global Management, The Carlyle Group, Bain Capital, Morgan Stanley Capital Partners, Goldman Sachs Assets, TPG, etc. To understand why private equity companies have so much appetite for healthcare investments, you need to understand the general private equity investment playbook. After private equity companies raises money, they take these funds and invest in opportunities that have the ability to produce a sizable return on investment within a short period. The typical investment holding period for many private equity investments is usually an average of 5 years. The healthcare industry has become very attractive to private equity companies because of the abundance of investment opportunities that can create huge returns on investments and healthcare entities that need capital to perform better or grow their business. Some of the factors that create these huge opportunities in healthcare include 1. The size of the industry. Healthcare is one of the largest industries in the United States. It makes up over 17% of the United States' gross domestic product. About $4.5 trillion was spent on healthcare expenditures in 2022, which is a good indication that there is a lot of money to be made in healthcare with the right value proposition. 2. Fragmentation. The fragmented nature of the United States healthcare delivery system makes it attractive for private equity because these companies see this as an opportunity to consolidate similar and complementary assets, create economies of scale, improve value or revenue, and sell or exit at a higher value than the acquisition cost. 3. Inefficiencies. Another reason why healthcare is very attractive for private equity companies is the magnitude of inefficiencies and waste that occurs in healthcare. Studies have shown that a third of every dollar spent in healthcare is wasted. Private equity companies see this as an opportunity to make investments that improve efficiency and increase returned value on investments made. 4. Changing demographics. Healthcare expenditures continue to grow with increasing demand for services, especially as the baby boomer generation ages. There is no indication that healthcare investments or expenditures will plummet anytime soon. 5. Predictable income. The revenue sources from healthcare services is almost guaranteed by payers, commercial insurance, or government insurance. This is usually a huge incentive for private equity companies. Private equity investments in healthcare have been growing consistently year over the past 20 years. For the reasons we just mentioned, it doesn't appear that private equity companies will shy away from healthcare anytime soon. Rather, there are strong indications that these companies will continue to make bigger investments in healthcare. According to data from PitchBook, private equity investments in healthcare have increased steadily over the last 14 years, with a peak in 2021 amounting to over $200 billion. So since there is a strong indication that private equity investments will continue to increase in healthcare, let's look at how these investments are structured and the impact these investments tend to have on healthcare services and the various stakeholders involved. Private equity investments in healthcare are structured in three major ways. 1. Leveraged buyouts, LBO. In leveraged buyout deals, the private equity company acquires ownership or majority stake in a healthcare entity, which could be a hospital, provider group, nursing home, etc. They do this by putting down a small percentage of the investment amount and taking out a loan for the remaining amount using the assets of the acquired entity as collateral for the loan. For example, if a private equity company wants to buy a hospital and the deal costs $50 million, the company will pay $5 million from its own capital, and then borrow the remaining $45 million using the hospital assets as collateral for the loan. Another practice that often common with leveraged buyouts is dividend recapitalization. Dividend recapitalization occurs when private equity firms put more debt on their acquired entities to get cash. This method is often criticized because it adds unnecessary debt to companies without improving their operations. This could lead to the companies facing restructuring, bankruptcy, or having to cut costs to pay off the debt and interest. This tactic is often used to give owners and investors a huge payout, even when the acquired entity is still struggling for survival. 2. Growth equity. Growth equity investment can be described simply as an investment or capital that a healthcare entity needs to fund growth and expansion or any strategic initiative. Sometimes, when organizations have challenges with raising capital, private equity companies step in to meet that need based on the agreed terms. Most times, the private equity company funding the deal will accept an equity stake in the company, and sometimes it's a loan that can be paid back with interest based on agreed terms. 3. Partnerships. Partnership investment deals in healthcare are structured in a manner that allows a private equity company to leverage the capabilities of another company that received its investment and identify a second company where both companies can work together to create unique synergies in products or services for the mutual benefit of each company. When these partnerships work well, the company that received the private equity investment can improve its value significantly, which gives the private equity company an opportunity to exit the investment profitably. Private equity investments are spread all over healthcare, and there are no signs of this trend slowing down anytime soon. These investments have produced mixed results depending on the healthcare segment involved. We will look at what research evidence shows and also what anecdotal evidence shows about the impact of these investments to understand the overall effect of private equity investments in healthcare. For the purpose of simplicity, let's look at the impact of private equity investments in 6 healthcare segments: hospitals, healthcare staffing, air ambulance, nursing homes, health insurance, pharmaceutical companies. In each of these areas, we'll look at the private equity business case for investments and the impacts results in each area. But first, let's look at what the overall research evidence shows. On the one hand, researchers found that hospitals with private equity investments generally fared better in terms of operational and financial indices than those without private equity investments, and clinical outcomes were almost the same, and in some instances better than that of other hospitals without private equity investments. On the other hand, a more recent study indicated that hospitals acquired by private equity companies had worse clinical outcomes when compared with other similar hospitals that do not have private equity investments. The study found that certain clinical quality outcomes tend to worsen in most hospitals after acquisition by private equity companies. The picture tends to be more compelling about the impacts of private equity companies on the different healthcare segments when you understand the typical private equity business playbook and other factors that tend to exacerbate the effect of these investments. We will look at the 6 different areas in healthcare with private equity investments, review the business case for each area to understand why such healthcare segments are prime targets for private equity investments, and look at some of the anecdotal evidence showing the impact of private equity investments in that area of healthcare. Hospitals. Hospitals seem to be attractive to private equity companies, and the trend is poised to continue growing. A recent example is when one of the leading private equity firms, General Catalyst, recently initiated the process to purchase a hospital system in Ohio. These investment opportunities are evaluated based on current inefficiencies in the hospital and available unexploited opportunities to maximize revenue. Most hospital acquisition deals by private equity companies are structured as leveraged buyouts. When a hospital acquisition is made, private equity companies tend to deploy their strategy and operational excellence capabilities to carry out reorganizations and institute changes that can maximize efficiency and increase the revenue of the acquired hospital. Different tactics are usually deployed depending on the circumstances around a target hospital. These include investments in technology upgrades, advanced equipment, staffing changes, especially for clinical staff, and in some instances, closing certain services that are no longer financially viable, even if the community still needs these services. Another key factor that may be central to private equity hospital acquisitions is the real estate assets of these hospitals. Many of these deals are structured as leverage buyouts. The assets of the hospital are later used as collateral to borrow money for the acquisition. The real estate assets are often used in sale-leaseback deals where the private equity company sells off the real estate assets. The hospital then leases the real estate from the entity that purchased it from the private equity company, forcing the hospital to add rent payments to its expenses in addition to servicing the loan obligations used for the leveraged buyout. Another strategy that private equity companies often use is the acquisition of different hospitals in different markets and consolidating them under one entity as a hospital system to create economies of scale. The consolidated hospital system is then later sold at a higher value after a few years. The operational results of a hospital after private equity takeover are often positive with higher revenues, but clinical and community impact results are often not so good. Some of these hospitals are rural hospitals that are often the only service providers in a locality. Closing financially unprofitable services can often create a crisis for the affected communities. Job losses can also have an indirect economic impact in the host community, and aggressive bill collection practices can also be financially devastating for impacted community members. Let's look at the case of Steward Health in Massachusetts to understand some of the challenges that often come with some private equity hospital acquisitions.
Hey, we have 2 new developments in the Steward healthcare crisis. We've learned Steward is looking to sell 4 hospitals. And late today, Mass General Brigham told its doctors to stop performing surgeries and procedures at Holy Family Hospital because they may not have the equipment they need. It appears it's not just a problem there at Holy Family. WBZ's Tiffany Chan spoke to a patient at another hospital who just had her surgery postponed.
Healthcare staffing is another care delivery segment that has proved to be fertile ground for private equity investments in healthcare. Private equity companies have seen this opportunity and have invested heavily in physician staffing companies. It is common to find providers in many hospital units, especially physicians hired by staffing companies to work in these hospitals. It is estimated that about 40% of hospital ERs are staffed by physicians hired by these companies. Many hospitals are unable to staff their departments and often resort to physician staffing companies to staff these units with doctors and other care providers. This is particularly common with rural hospitals who find it difficult to compete for scarce physician resources. It can be very difficult to recruit and retain providers in order to staff these hospitals. Private equity-backed provider staffing companies have seen this need and have ceased the opportunity to provide staffing for hospitals. The companies usually hire providers and post them to these hospitals to provide services. The main incentive is the high demand for provider services and the likelihood of high revenue generation from these services. On the other hand, this helps hospitals to provide care to their communities and also avoid revenue losses. While this makes it easier for hospitals to be able to provide services to their community, it often comes at a steep cost. Most of these staffing companies can be out of network for many health insurance companies. So when you receive services in any of the departments or units staffed by their physicians or care providers, you, the patient, will have to pay 100% of the bill because your insurance company will deny any claims the company sends to them, because they do not have any network agreements with the staffing company. Another facet of private equity involvement in physician staffing is the direct acquisition of physician practices by private equity companies. This often involves buying controlling equity in a provider practice and taking over the management of that practice, while the physician owners only focus on the clinical aspects of the practice. This trend is common with specialty physician practices where private equity companies focus on a specific specialties like anesthesia, urology, radiology, orthopedics, primary care, etc., to purchase various practices that are similar to build a large specialty provider group. This helps the private equity owner to leverage economies of scale to increase revenue, often by improving efficiency, focusing on high margins, increasing prices, especially when the group practice has market dominance in a locality. These companies often tend to utilize very aggressive bill collection methods, and the bills are often very outrageous compared to how much the patient can afford to pay, or even the normal rates that insurance companies pay for such services. Another segment of healthcare that has attracted a lot of interest and appetite from private equity companies is nursing homes and senior living facilities. Private equity investments in nursing homes have increased steadily over the last 10 years. The business case for private equity investments in nursing homes is not too different from that of hospitals. One thing that makes investments in nursing homes attractive for private equity companies is the consistent revenues from the government, private payers, and demographic trends indicating that more baby boomers are aging now, and seniors will likely make up about 20% of the United States population by year 2030. Hence, the demand for nursing home services will continue to grow barring any unforeseen circumstances. In some instances, the real estate assets of these homes can also be very attractive since many of them are part of a nursing home or senior living chain. When private equity companies invest in a nursing home chain, they typically want to improve the operational efficiency of these homes, increase revenues, and sell them at a profit. Unfortunately, the use of dividend recapitalization, where more money could be borrowed using the assets of these homes as collateral for the loans, is often common. This further strains the resources of these entities with additional debt burden, and it doesn't always translate to improvements in quality outcomes or better experiences for the residents. Recent studies have shown that nursing homes under private, equity-backed ownership tend to cost more and have worse quality outcomes when compared to similar nursing homes that are not owned by private equity companies. Air ambulance is another segment of healthcare that private equity companies have shown significant interests. Just like any other area of healthcare, private equity investments in medical air ambulance segment of healthcare have been on the increase over the years with significant consolidation of companies that provide these services. For instance, according to a Government Accountability Office report, private equity companies, KKR and American Securities, own 2 out of the 3 companies with the largest market share of air ambulance market in the United States. The is similar for privately owned ground ambulance and emergency services. The business case for private equity investments in air ambulance and emergency services is not too different from that of other healthcare delivery segments. Because of high barriers of entry, service providers in this segment of healthcare are not as many as other healthcare delivery segments. Air ambulance companies provide very important services that can often be the difference maker in life and death situations, especially when it comes down to race against time situation to save a life. However, these critical service often comes at a steep cost that barely anyone can afford. One of the incentives for companies providing this service is the ability to bill whatever amount they want for services, especially when the patient's insurance is out of network. There is also little competition compared to other healthcare services, and an air ambulance company can completely dominate the market in some localities because of consolidation efforts that private equity companies often undertake. They start by acquiring one air ambulance company, then continue buying other companies and merging them with their initial acquisition until it becomes a large company. By doing this, they are able to utilize economies of scale to negotiate prices with payers and their suppliers, thereby reducing their operational costs while significantly increasing their revenues. As life-saving as these services can be, they don't come cheap, and the patient is often not in the best state to decide or find out whether the ambulance company is in network. This leaves a huge financial burden on the patients to pay the bills, especially if the insurance company won't cover it, or if the insurance company agrees to only pay part of the bill. Ambulance companies can decide to collect the balance of the bill from the patient using aggressive methods like debt collections, and in some cases, sue patients to pay the debt. Health insurance is a healthcare delivery segment with many companies that are very strong financially, but often leverage private equity investments and partnerships to meet their needs. Healthcare coverage has grown significantly since the passage of the Affordable Care Act, with a lot of transformation, and the industry continues to grow and evolve very fast. Health insurance companies are rapidly consolidating and making investments in new areas to maintain and grow their revenues and market share. All of these require a lot of capital to undertake, and this is where private equity companies come in. Most private equity investments in the health insurance segment of the healthcare delivery system are usually structured as growth equity capital or partnerships. With the rapid growth and consolidation happening in health insurance, most health insurance companies are evolving into healthcare services companies that provide services across the different areas of healthcare, often through subsidiary companies. This type of growth and consolidation requires huge capital investments. Companies that cannot afford the capital required for expansion and consolidation efforts often fall victim or become prey for the large companies to acquire. This has created a huge opportunity for private equity companies to participate in these growth and expansion opportunities by providing alternative source of capital for health insurance companies. Health insurance companies also often prefer to borrow from private equity companies than issuing bonds or borrowing at a higher interest from banks. Private equity companies often offer technical support and strategic advice to these health insurance companies because of their expertise and capabilities in this industry. It is also common to see private equity companies facilitate partnership relationships between health insurance companies and other companies in which they have existing investments to create synergistic or complementary relationships that will benefit all the entities involved. Humana partnered with a private equity company, Welsh, Carson, Anderson & Stowe, WayCS, to invest over $1 billion in developing value-based clinics. Humana also entered into another partnership deal worth $4 billion with two other private equity companies, TPG Capital and WCAS, to acquire another healthcare services company, Kindred. Elevance Health has also entered into similar agreements with private equity company Clayton, Dubilier and Rice, CDR, to create a partnership between Elevance Health subsidiary, Carolyn, and two other entities, Apri Health and multi-specialty physicians with active investments from CDR. Another segment of the healthcare delivery system that private equity companies are eager to invest in is the pharmaceutical and therapeutic segment of healthcare. If you know anything about U.S. healthcare, you will know that medicines are very expensive in the United States. The cost of medicines and pharmaceutical products is one of the major cost drivers in healthcare. However, development of these therapies and medications to bring them to market is usually a very expensive endeavor, and that is where private equity companies step in. Recent data indicates that private equity investments in pharmaceuticals have been growing steadily over the past few years, with a slight decline in 2023. The research and development costs for medications and therapeutic products can be very expensive. Typically, medicinal products usually go through at least 3 phases of clinical trials before receiving the Food and Drug Administration (FDA) approval to market these medicines to the public. And this is besides all the research and development work that occurs before the clinical trial phase. Phase 3. Clinical trials are usually the most expensive, and many companies usually run out of money at this point. The commonly available options are to either raise capital or get acquired by another company. Private equity companies usually like taking advantage of these types of opportunities to provide the needed capital for Phase 3 trials or continued drug development efforts. The deals are often structured as growth equity, where a private equity company takes an equity stake in the company or a complete acquisition of the company in some instances. This puts the private equity company in a position to benefit from the financial windfall when the FDA grants final approval to any of the drug candidates in development. A major private equity company, Elliott Investment Management, recently completed the acquisition of a pharmaceutical services company, Syneos, taking it private in a deal worth over $7 billion. Leading private equity company Blackstone has invested a large pharmaceutical company, Sanofi, in addition to setting up a dedicated fund for biopharmaceutical investments. Other large private equity companies also have similar investment funds that are targeting opportunities in the pharmaceutical industry. It is evident that private equity companies make significant contributions to the sustenance of the healthcare delivery system. But to determine whether private equity investments in pharmaceutical industry contributes to the high cost of medicines in the United States is a separate discussion altogether. Let us know in the comments if you'll like to see a video on this topic. However, it is clear that consumers of healthcare services and their communities are often indirectly harmed or left at a disadvantage with little options as a result of unintended consequences of private equity investments in healthcare. It is also clear that changes need to happen, especially at the policy level, to mitigate some of the practices that tend to leave consumers in difficult situations while private equity companies walk away with huge returns on their investments. One of such policy loopholes that was recently closed is the passage of No Surprises Bill, which was signed into law as No Surprise Act in 2022. This prevents entities, including those backed by private equity, from charging patients outrageous bills for services, among other things. The No Surprises Act is just one step in the right direction. There are other areas that need urgent attention to address challenges that are common with private equity investments in healthcare. Some of these areas include more transparency in private equity-led hospital acquisition investments, regulatory measures that will prevent certain deals from avoiding antitrust scrutiny. Steps should also be taken to create incentives to encourage more private equity participation in healthcare delivery system in a manner that prevents the actions that often lead to harm or unintended results. On the other hand, it is certain that private equity companies will not sit idle and watch opportunities taken away from them. These companies have robust, well-funded advocacy organizations that will lobby the government to get the best deals for their member organizations. This is a common practice for many industry groups, and private equity has a well-funded industry advocacy group that will hold nothing back to prevent legislation that can disrupt their industry playbook. For example, this capability was demonstrated when private equity companies with largest investments in physician staffing companies unleashed a $53 million at spend to lobby for favorable legislation in the No Surprises Bill passed in 2022. It is certain that the impact of private equity investments in healthcare will continue to be the subject of debates, but policy changes, whether at the national or state level, will be needed for any changes to happen in private equity investments in healthcare. Please subscribe to this channel if you find this content valuable, and let us know any feedback in the comments, and also let us know the kind of healthcare topics you would like us to create videos on.